I used to think every family had a favorite punching bag. Then I attended enough reunions to realize that most families eventually outgrow that phase. Mine treated it like a treasured tradition. My father had spent 30 years building one of the largest interstellar import-export companies in our sector. If you listened to him talk for more than 5 minutes, you'd think he had personally invented commerce. Every conversation somehow circled back to his business. Every meal became a shareholder meeting. Every holiday transformed into an awards ceremony where he congratulated himself for existing. And every reunion featured one special attraction: me. While my cousins worked in the company, climbed corporate ladders, and proudly displayed titles that sounded increasingly ridiculous, I remained the family mystery. "What exactly do you do all day?" became the most common question directed at me. The funny part was that I always answered honestly. "I'm a government auditor." Nobody ever believed me. Apparently, according to my relatives, government auditors were supposed to be old, boring, and constantly angry. Since I was only 31 and generally looked relaxed, they assumed I was making it up. My father especially enjoyed mocking my career. "Auditor?" he'd say. "That's a fancy word for unemployed." The entire family would laugh every single time. The joke never improved with age. What made it even funnier was that my father had absolutely no idea what kind of auditor I actually was. I worked for the Galactic Compliance Authority. My department investigated corporate fraud, regulatory violations, and financial misconduct across dozens of star systems. When companies saw my name attached to a file, executives suddenly remembered important meetings they needed to attend on distant planets. But my family didn't know any of that. The only person who appreciated the irony was my girlfriend. Her name was Lyra. She wasn't human. She came from a highly organized alien civilization famous for following regulations so strictly that crossing a street incorrectly could generate a 30-page report. Naturally, she loved compliance work. We met during an investigation 3 years earlier and somehow fell in love while examining shipping manifests and tax records. Romance works differently when both people enjoy catching criminals. The morning of the reunion, Lyra appeared on my tablet screen while I was getting dressed. "You could simply tell them the truth," she said. "I could. Instead, you're going to let them embarrass themselves again." "Probably." She sighed dramatically. One thing I loved about Lyra was that despite belonging to an incredibly disciplined species, she secretly enjoyed chaos. Especially when it happened to people who deserved it. "They're going to insult you all afternoon," she warned. "They always do. And your father will brag about the company. Definitely. And he'll eventually call you a disappointment. Almost guaranteed." She leaned closer to the screen. "You know your department is currently reviewing his company." I smiled. "Funny coincidence." "There is absolutely nothing coincidental about it." She wasn't wrong. The review had started 6 months earlier. What we'd discovered so far was concerning. Not criminal. Just spectacularly careless. The kind of paperwork mistakes that happen when people believe success makes them immune to regulations. By the time I arrived at the reunion hall, nearly 50 relatives had already gathered. The moment I walked inside, I saw exactly what I expected. My father standing in the center of the room. A crowd surrounding him. And a giant display screen showing company profits. He looked happier than a man celebrating his birthday. He looked like a king addressing loyal subjects. "There he is!" one cousin shouted when he noticed me. Several relatives turned toward me. The smiles told me everything. The entertainment had arrived. My father spotted me and grinned. Not the warm kind of grin a parent gives a child. The kind a comedian gives an audience before delivering a joke. Unfortunately, I was usually the joke. I grabbed a drink and prepared for another unforgettable family reunion. Somewhere across the galaxy, Lyra was probably placing bets on how long it would take before everything exploded. If I knew my family, not long at all. The reunion dinner officially began 20 minutes later, which meant my father finally had a captive audience. That was always his favorite kind. Everyone gathered around the massive banquet tables while servers carried in food from half a dozen worlds. My cousins talked loudly about promotions. My uncles compared investments. My aunts exchanged gossip that somehow traveled faster than light. And my father stood at the head of the room preparing another speech nobody had requested. A dangerous sparkle appeared in his eyes. I recognized it immediately. Someone was about to get embarrassed. Specifically me. He raised his glass. The room quieted. "I'd like to thank everyone for being here," he announced dramatically. "This family has always believed in hard work, dedication, and personal responsibility." Several relatives nodded as if he were delivering wisdom from a mountain summit. "The company has never been stronger." Applause followed. "We've expanded to 12 sectors." More applause. "We've increased profits by 30%. Even more applause. I focused on my meal. Experience had taught me that ignoring him was usually the safest strategy. Unfortunately, my father wasn't finished. He glanced toward me. The moment our eyes met, I knew exactly where this speech was heading. "Success doesn't happen by accident," he continued. "It comes from commitment. It comes from making good decisions." A few cousins smirked. They saw it too. Then came the inevitable turn. "Of course," my father said. "Sometimes people choose a different path." Several relatives laughed before he even finished the sentence. I sighed. Here we go again. My father pointed directly at me. "For example, my son." The entire room turned. It was almost impressive how quickly 50 people could stop eating when potential drama appeared. While his cousins joined the family business and built successful careers, he decided to do. He paused. "Whatever it is he does." Laughter exploded around the room. One cousin nearly choked on a drink. Another slapped the table. I kept eating. My father interpreted my silence as permission to continue. A terrible mistake. "When he was younger, I thought he'd eventually figure things out," he said. "Then 1 year became 5 years. 5 years became 10. More laughter. My aunt leaned forward. "Maybe he's still figuring out what he wants to be when he grows up." The room erupted again. Even some relatives who normally stayed neutral joined in. Across the room, my tablet vibrated. A message from Lyra. "How bad is it?" I quickly typed back. "They're setting new records." A response arrived instantly. "Excellent. Continue observing." I smiled despite myself. My father noticed. "See? He thinks this is funny." "It kind of is," I replied. That only encouraged him. He launched into a full speech about legacy, responsibility, ambition, and family pride. Every few minutes he used me as an example of what not to do with your life. The performance grew increasingly ridiculous. By the end, you'd think I spent my days sleeping in alleyways and stealing food from children. Finally, he raised his glass one last time. "And that," he declared proudly, "is why he remains the greatest disappointment this family has ever produced." The room went silent. Even a few relatives looked uncomfortable. Apparently there was still a line somewhere. My father had sprinted past it. I slowly stood from my chair. Several cousins exchanged excited looks. They expected yelling. Maybe a dramatic argument. Possibly years of suppressed emotions exploding all at once. Instead, I calmly straightened my jacket. "Finished?" I asked. My father laughed. "Have something to say?" "Not much." The room waited. I took a sip of water. Then I smiled. "You know what's funny? My actual job involves reviewing corporate compliance records." Several relatives rolled their eyes. My father laughed louder than anyone. "Sure it does. It does. You couldn't manage a lemonade stand." More laughter. I nodded thoughtfully. Then I reached beside my chair and picked up my briefcase. That finally got everyone's attention. Slowly I opened it. Inside sat a sealed government envelope. The official insignia on the front immediately caught my father's eye. His smile faded slightly. I walked across the room and handed it directly to him. He looked confused. The room suddenly became very quiet. "What is this?" he asked. I stepped back toward the exit. "You'll want to read that carefully." Before anyone could stop me, I turned and walked out. Behind me, confused whispers spread across the room. The last thing I heard before the doors closed was my father laughing nervously. 5 minutes later, that laughter was going to disappear forever. I was halfway across the parking lot when my communicator started vibrating. Once. Twice. Then continuously. I didn't even need to check who was calling. The timing made it obvious. I answered. My father's face appeared on the screen. For the first time in my life, he looked completely speechless. That alone was worth the last 10 years. "Hello, Dad?" "What is this?" he demanded. "The envelope." "I know it's the envelope." I could hear chaos behind him. Actual chaos. People shouting. Furniture moving. Someone screaming about financial records. Music had stopped. Apparently dinner was over. I leaned against my vehicle. "Did you read all of it?" His face somehow became paler. "There are 73 violations listed. 76, actually. The last page continues." Silence. Then I heard an aunt yelling in the background. "Who approved the shipping forms?" An uncle immediately shouted back. "Not me!" Another voice joined. "You signed them. I thought they were different forms." I smiled. The investigation hadn't even officially started yet. My father lowered his voice. "You've been auditing my company?" "For 6 months." 6 months? Technically 8. His eye twitched. Behind him, the reunion was collapsing at impressive speed. One cousin sprinted across the room carrying stacks of documents. Another was stuffing folders into decorative flower arrangements. For reasons I still don't understand, one uncle appeared to be hiding paperwork inside a cake. I wasn't sure whether that violated additional regulations. It probably did. "Dad," I said carefully, "destroying records after receiving an audit notice is a terrible idea." His eyes widened. He turned around. Half the family instantly froze. Apparently they'd forgotten I was still connected to the call. The cousin holding documents slowly lowered them. The uncle holding cake-covered paperwork looked particularly guilty. "You heard that?" Dad asked. "I heard everything." Several relatives immediately abandoned their hiding attempts. Smart decision. Panic makes people incredibly creative. Unfortunately, it rarely makes them intelligent. A new voice suddenly appeared behind me. "How bad is it?" I turned. Lyra had arrived. She stepped from a transport shuttle wearing her official compliance uniform. The timing couldn't have been better. Her silver eyes landed on my communicator screen. Then she saw my father. Then she saw the terrified relatives behind him. A smile appeared. A dangerous smile. The kind she usually wore when someone accidentally confessed to 12 separate violations. "Oh," she said happily. "They're already panicking." My father stared. "You know her?" I nearly laughed. "Of course I know her." Lyra moved beside me. "Hello, sir." My father recognized her immediately. Not as my girlfriend. As something much worse. The insignia on her uniform. His face lost what little color remained. "No." "Yes," Lyra replied cheerfully. "No. I'm Senior Compliance Investigator Lyra Vesh." The room behind him went silent. Completely silent. One could almost hear 50 people simultaneously reconsidering every life decision that had brought them to this moment. My father blinked. "You work on the audit too?" Lyra nodded. "I helped write most of it." Several relatives gasped. One aunt actually sat down before she fainted. Another cousin quietly disappeared from camera view. Probably to search for documents he had hidden 30 seconds earlier. The reunion had transformed from a family celebration into a disaster movie. And it was magnificent. Suddenly everyone wanted to talk to me. The same cousins who had mocked me an hour earlier now crowded around my father. One wanted advice. Another wanted reassurance. A third wanted to know whether accidentally signing forms counted as fraud. The answer was almost always no. But the fact he asked was interesting. Very interesting. Lyra folded her arms. I think your family is investigating itself for us. They're certainly saving us time. My father rubbed his forehead. For years he had viewed me as the family failure. The disappointment. The disgrace. Now he was staring at official documents identifying me as the lead auditor overseeing the biggest investigation his company had ever faced. The irony finally landed. Hard. For a moment nobody spoke. Then an uncle shouted from somewhere off-screen. Whose idea was it to ignore the regulation updates? Instantly 12 people began arguing. The call dissolved into complete madness. Lyra watched with fascination. I watched with satisfaction. And somewhere in the middle of the chaos, my father finally realized the most painful truth of all. The son he'd spent years laughing at was the only person in the room who actually knew what he was doing. The following 6 weeks became the most entertaining period of my professional career. Not because the investigation uncovered anything criminal. It didn't. My father wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was something far more dangerous. A successful businessman who believed rules were suggestions. The audit revealed years of ignored compliance updates, outdated procedures, incomplete documentation, and enough filing mistakes to keep an entire department busy. The penalties were expensive. The mandatory corrections were exhausting. The paperwork alone probably qualified as a small moon. Yet compared to what could have happened, my family got lucky. Very lucky. The company survived. In fact, after implementing all the required changes, it actually became more efficient than before. I tried explaining that to my father. He wasn't interested. For nearly a month, he treated compliance regulations the same way ancient civilizations treated curses. Then something unexpected happened. One evening he called and asked if we could meet privately. No lawyers. No accountants. No relatives. Just the two of us. That request alone nearly made me fall out of my chair. When I arrived, he looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Just tired. Like a man who had spent several weeks discovering that consequences were real. For a while neither of us spoke. Then he sighed. I owe you an apology. I nearly checked the room for hidden cameras. My father apologizing was rarer than faster than light traffic moving on schedule. You don't have to. Yes, I do. His voice was quiet. I spent years assuming success only looked one way. I listened. I thought joining the company was the only path worth respecting. He shook his head. And while I was busy judging you, you built a career that half the sector is afraid of. That was probably true. Several executives had literally changed planets after receiving audit notices. My father actually laughed. A genuine laugh this time. The worst part is that you warned us. I did. You told us you were an auditor. I did. We just thought you were joking. I couldn't argue with that. For the first time in years, the conversation felt normal. No insults. No lectures. No audience. Just a father finally seeing his son clearly. When I returned home that night, Lyra was waiting. The moment she saw me, she smirked. He apologized, didn't he? How do you always know? Because your species is predictable. She wrapped her arms around me. Also because he called me afterward. I blinked. He what? She laughed. He asked for advice? That image was so ridiculous I almost choked. My father voluntarily asking an auditor for advice. The universe truly was capable of miracles. Months later, family gatherings became very different. The cousins who once mocked me suddenly became unbelievably polite. One even asked if I could review his business records. Another brought me gifts. A third looked nervous every time I entered a room. I enjoyed all of it far more than I probably should have. The biggest change, however, came from my father. At the next reunion, someone jokingly asked if I was still the family disgrace. The entire room froze. My father stood up immediately. No. Everyone waited. He pointed at me. That's the reason we now read every government document twice. The room exploded with laughter. Even I couldn't help smiling. Later that evening, Lyra rested her head against my shoulder while relatives celebrated nearby. Your family is much less chaotic now, she said. I looked around. Several cousins were carefully organizing paperwork. An uncle was double-checking tax records. My aunt had created labeled folders for everything. No, I said. They're just scared. Lyra laughed so hard she nearly spilled her drink. As I watched my family, I realized something important. Humanity's greatest strength was never our technology. It wasn't our ships. It wasn't our wealth. It was our ability to stay calm while everyone else lost their minds. Sometimes the smartest move wasn't winning an argument. Sometimes it was quietly handing someone an envelope and letting reality do all the work. And judging by how fast my relatives still hid paperwork whenever I walked into a room, that lesson was going to last for a very long time.